Hello, and welcome to this Facebook Live. I'm here to talk to you about this book, International Organisations and Global Problems, a textbook published by Cambridge University Press. If you have a question, please feel free to pop it into the comments and we'll either reply now or get back to you later. For everyone out there in lockdown, I just want to say that I'm thinking of you and I hope that you and yours are safe. So my name's Susan Park. I'm a Professor of Global Governance at the University of Sydney in the Department of Government and International Relations. And it's a great pleasure to be here on Facebook as part of Cambridge University Press's Lecture Lockdown series. So I've been teaching international organisations in some format or other since I became a lecturer in 2003. I teach international organisations as part of a Politics and International Relations core program at the undergraduate level and as a core unit in our Masters of International Relations at the postgraduate level. It was my experience teaching these units that really led me to write this textbook. So perhaps like you all, I tried to design a curricula that engages students in research-led but also student-focused teaching. So I try to do that by utilising cutting-edge research on explanations of organisational change. Research on international organisations continues at a really fast pace in terms of theoretical testing and application, fine-grained empirical analysis, in-depth case studies, and increasingly the testing of general propositions with large I/O datasets. So over time, I've really tried to modify my teaching in response to student feedback. And the two units that I'm teaching, both at the undergraduate and the postgraduate level, have developed over time. So I've changed the amount, brought in actually more theoretical component into my undergraduate classes and changed the reading requirements for my master's class, making it more conceptual sometimes based on student feedback. So this is all part of this closing the loop process, listening to student feedback, adjusting the readings and the requirements. And it was really this iterative process that inspired my scholarship in teaching, leading me to publish this book, International Organisations and Global Problems, Theories and Explanations. It really was an attempt to try and improve how I taught those units to provide a sort of scaffolding for the whole range of different international organisations that we can study at the international level. So ultimately, the book tries to distill about 15 years worth of teaching of international organisations into this 11-chapter analysis of how we theorise and how we understand international organisations. So the book departs, I think, from some other standard books on international organisations in two key ways. The first is that it looks at which theories have been used to study international organisations, a contribution that demonstrates how some theories are much more applicable to some international organisations than others. So this challenges students to think through whether theories are universal and, if they are not, to probe how theory is being used and for what purpose. So it's a deliberate distinction to question what the purpose of theories are. So in the book, I use contemporary theories of international relations and international organisation, specifically neo-realist and neoliberal institutionalism, rationalism in the form of the principal agent model, and constructivist theories based on organisational culture. And I use these to examine how and why international organisations behave the way they do, and whether they can make a difference in tackling the problems of the 21st century. So everything from war and unrest, the spread of weapons, financial crises, climate change, terrorism, international development problems, including poverty and inequality, stalling international trade negotiations, and of course, global pandemics. So if you're just joining in, my name's Susan Park. I'm a Professor of Global Governance, and I'm here talking about the textbook, International Organisations and Global Problems, Theories and Explanations. So while there is a focus throughout the book on mainstream international organisation and I/O theories, there are text boxes on a range of alternative theoretical approaches to international organisation. So for example, dependency theory is mentioned in relation to economic development in the chapter on development. Institutionalism appears in the chapter on providing global health. So the book doesn't intend to be prescriptive in terms of the types of theories that can be used in any course on international organisation. But what it does try to do is to give students the basis for how to apply mainstream theories to specific IOs. So what this really tries to do is to open the space for lecturers to incorporate alternative theoretical approaches, either through their lectures or through required readings for their students. While I stick to the dominant 4 theories in a textbook in my course, this really doesn't have to be the case. And I think there is room to use the book alongside other theories, such as Marxism, critical or feminist approaches that could be counterpoints to theories expounded in the book. So I use my textbook in conjunction with more specific readings on particular international organisations, and these are updated regularly in relation to what is happening in the world. I'm just going to pop open the questions to make sure what sort of courses would this book be useful for? So that's a great question. It's primarily to courses on international organisation and international law, international institutions. It can be used across a range of different of specific units on institutions or organisations, but it could also be used, so that's a great question, just popping up there on the screen, what could it be used for? It could also be used in conjunction with more specific units, like units on the United Nations, where you get a flavour of and can still apply the theoretical components to the UN. And there's a number of UN-specific organisations that are mentioned in the book. So this is really for international relations, for political science, for international organisations and international institutions, but it does cross over into law, which could also be used. So are there certain, there's also another question in the chat, are there certain chapters that would be suitable for advanced courses? Yes, look, I pitch it both high and low. I teach it in my undergraduate course and I also teach it in my postgraduate course. I don't think, to my mind, the difference is the extent to what students actually get out of it rather than where you're pitching it. So I pitched it as an upper undergraduate unit level textbook, but you could also understand it at the postgraduate level. And certainly the feedback that I've got is that it is appropriate at that level as well. So in terms of the theoretical approach, it's really open to be used in conjunction with the 4 dominant theoretical approaches that I present in the book, but you can use others as well. And I use my textbook in conjunction with more specific readings on particular international organisations. And these really, as I said, are updated in relation to what is happening in the world. So I generally, when I set my textbook, I set a chapter from the textbook, I set a specific reading about a particular organisation that we may be studying, and I then usually put online a newspaper article, a podcast, or a report of something current to pique their interest. So I've got a question from Gareth here. Have you any feedback from stakeholders in IOs noting how the contents have impacted on their thinking? I haven't got any from stakeholders themselves, but I do have, I have had students in my class that have worked for international organisations telling me that this is the first time that they've been able to identify exactly the processes whereby states use certain levers to shape the organisation's actions, and that they found that to be so incredibly valuable in being able to ascertain through the course how the organisation is being manipulated. So really useful feedback from students that have worked in international organisations. So as I said, I provide the textbook, a specific journal article, a podcast or a newspaper article, and of course I provide recommended readings in my online learning platform. So in my classes, that is Canvas. So the book obviously also has recommended readings at the end of each chapter, and it has questions that you can use to pitch to your classes. So that's quite handy. You're absolutely right, Gareth. That is self-awareness. for those students identifying how states are manipulating how international organisations are operating. So I wrote this book deliberately in a way that was not about a specific IO per chapter. I deliberately widened the scope of the chapters to highlight that there are a range of international organisations operating in any given issue area. So for this reason, the book has a degree of flexibility built into it, enabling lecturers the opportunity to really riff off into specific international organisations depending what their interests are, or in relation to specific events. So, for example, the chapter on creating regional international organisations introduces students to the European Union, to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and to the Organisation of American States. Now, I'm based in the Asia Pacific, so I tend to teach my class on regional organisations to the region, which is what the students are relatively familiar with and want to know more about. But of course, in the last 2 years, Brexit has really directed my lectures and my attention and my students' attention to what is happening in the European Union, to its role and its potential fate. So the book is only really 11 chapters, and recognisably, many units are actually longer than this. And this was also a kind of deliberate room to give you space to add in weeks that help you focus on your specific interests. So you can continue through the theoretical framework to those specific topics. So for me, I add an extra week on security. So I generally break my weeks of security up, talking about traditional understandings of security, why the United Nations was created the way it was, and what its function and mandate is. And then I add an extra week, and that week can also change. So depending on the specific security problem, it could be terrorism, it could be nuclear non-proliferation. Again, trying to find a way to provide that space for the lecturer to tailor it to their specific interests or to the interests of the students in relation to what is going on in the world. So the second key feature of the book is that it questions whether alternatives exist for how we govern. So most books on international organisations assume that the only way to address global problems is through international organisations. So in the book, I try and counter this assumption by introducing alternative actors to states and international organisations. So this can be in the form of activists, non-government organisations and foundations, and argue that these two need to be examined in the same way that we examine international organisations. So in the terms of their political, economic and normative dependence on others and their organisational hypocrisies and pathologies. So this is not to suggest that the book is not about intergovernmental organisations. It absolutely is. The vast bulk of the book really does focus on that. But the book seeks to help students answer what I see as 4 key questions about the role of international organisations in the international system. So the first question is, what explains the emergence and evolution of international organisations in international politics? And this is addressed in chapter 1. So it's a historical evolutionary chapter about, what preceded formal intergovernmental organisations. The second question is, what theories can explain how and why international organisations operate the way they do? So this follows on from the historical evolutionary chapter, and this is where I introduce the 4 main theories of the book. These are the 4 theories that I then use throughout all of the thematic chapters. The third question is, can international organisations solve problems in the international system? And this is where each chapter examines specifically what the problem is. What are the issues we're talking about with global health? What are the issues we talk about with development, with trade, with finance, with security? So it examines what the issue area is and whether international organisations that I discuss in that book have the mandate, have the function, and have the resources to address both current and emerging problems. Because as we know, how we understand these concerns, how we understand the environment has changed over time quite considerably. The fourth question that I seek to answer throughout the textbook, or really sort of almost pose as a question for the students, is, are we facing a crisis of multilateralism in the 21st century? And it's this last question that really, I think, comes out of all of the unit and the whole textbook that comes before it. So identifying week after week after week what most of the successes and or failings of international organisations are. And it's kind of at the culmination of that, at the end of the unit, the end of the textbook, where we ask these questions. Given the rise of current populism and nationalism, that's not touched on so much in the concluding chapter, but it's certainly touched on in the textbook on Brexit, is that where and how do international organisations fit in contemporary international relations, addressing problems now that we've seen a shift towards a more global governance way of addressing problems. So those are the four questions that I ask in the book and through my course. So one question here is, does the textbook contain resources for exam preparation? I think that's a fantastic question. Like I said, I put questions at the end of each chapter to give to sort of prompt revision and reflection. And to be honest, I do use those in my exam preparation, and I may have actually used those in my exams. So what I normally do at the end of the class, taking all of taking some questions from the readings that other readings that I said as well. I with my exam preparation, I put all those questions together. I put them in a hat and I pulled them out, and that's the exam preparation that I do with my students. So you don't know which question is going to come out of the hat, in the same way that the students just don't know which exam questions are going to be on the final paper. I'm going to talk more about that, about the assessments in a minute. But I do want to say that if you are joining us, my name is Susan Park and I'm a Professor of Global Governance at the University of Sydney, and I'm talking about the textbook International Organisations and Global Problems. So really, the chapters can be read in any order, although the theory chapter does set out an overarching guide as to how to read the IOs in each of the thematic chapters. So each of the chapters is structured in exactly the same way. It examines key operating IOs in the international issue areas and the main issues and problems that they face. And it seeks to assess how and why they behave the way they do in terms of the opportunities and constraints that they face. So it really does locate international organisation in a crowded field of international and transnational actors seeking to govern the globe. And it tries to apply these relevant theories to international organisations, and also provides or gives the students the tools to investigate the activities of international organisations, and really to make up their own mind about the importance of international organisations in solving global problems in the international system. So what are the features of the textbook that support distance teaching? This, I've thought about this quite a bit. I think one of the benefits of the book is that it has a glossary. Now, I think this is really important if the university libraries have shut, or if students are no longer on campus or no longer able to move around if they're in isolation. So the book has a glossary if they can't access key textbooks. And I think one of the benefits of publishing this book was that electronic copies are available for purchase via Zookal or Amazon. So you can download the Kindle version instantaneously rather than having to wait for the post and wherever you are in the world. The postal systems are all quite stretched. So my library this semester, for the first time, is actually trialling an e-copy in addition to the short loans that we have for our students. And that was in response to the demand to access the copy, to access the book. So I have some experience teaching distance education. Actually, my first tenure track position was at a university that did do distance education, Deakin University in Melbourne. And I had mixed mode teaching, both online and face-to-face. So quite a few of us are in this position right now. So my students were listening to my recorded lectures, and their materials used to be posted out to them. And later, these were available to them online. So I have some experience with forgetting to record a lecture and then spending another 2 hours re-recording it to make sure that my students got it. Do you define the problems on the nexus of sectors or align them more with public sector organisations? It's a really good question I've got from May here. She also has a previous question: what are the global problems mentioned in the book? So the types of global problems are conflict between states, financial crises, free trade and the turn towards protectionism, the spread of infectious diseases and pandemics. And the second question that she had, so these run a gamut, right, from financial, the structure of financial security of the whole financial system through to climate change. So the second question was, do you define the problems on the nexus of sectors or align them more with public sector organisations? I think that's a really great question, because it's ultimately about two things, really. It's about the actual problem itself, so finance and the environment are very, very different from the spread of infectious diseases, but they're all similar in the sense, as the former Secretary General of the United Nations said, these are all problems without passports. So these are all issues that can spread and everyone can be affected by them. So one of the reasons why looking at international organisations is so useful is that we can get to these problems without passports. But of course, there are some sector-specific issues involved, right? Conflict has, depending on the nature of the conflict, is its own specific issue area. So it is broken up into those thematic areas, looking at health versus the environment versus development versus conflict. But it also, as you say, aligns with public sector organisations in the sense that these are bureaucracies, and they are bureaucracies comprised of professional staff. So those professional bureaucracies are still must still respond to their member states' demands, and what those member states' demands are can change over time. So what I've been talking about quite a bit is how we can try and use the textbook in a lockdown type process, doing online or distance education. It is sort of teaching online because for many of us, we're just being thrust into this, and we're adapting as we go. So when Sydney, for example, went into lockdown in March and April, I had to shift my classes online like many of you, which meant that I had to pre-record my lectures in the evenings while my children were asleep and undertake homeschooling during the daytime. So at that stage, I was teaching my master's class, and I was teaching it intensively. So we shifted from face-to-face tutorials and seminars to a minimum online discussion post type system. And this was really in lieu of having that direct interaction face-to-face. And it was really kind of the only way I could sustain it because I was homeschooling. So this meant that the students could post a minimum of 3 posts, and then for 1 hour we were live, and I was answering those posts and engaging in some really speed typing, but also a lot of fantastic interaction with them. So it was pretty intense, but I think it worked quite well in the end. Now this semester I'm teaching my undergraduate students. I'm teaching the same book, but in a slightly different way in terms of the expectations that I have about what they understand or what they take from the unit. And I'm very, very lucky that the schools here where I live are now open. So that means that my kids are at school, and it means that I can teach synchronously, face-to-face live like this. It's also because my institution, the University of Sydney, decided not to resume face-to-face lectures in order for public safety. But they did open it up to students, to staff if they were interested in having face-to-face small tutorials. So for this semester, I decided to teach live face-to-face synchronous Zoom lectures, and my tutor is teaching in live Zoom tutorials with breakout rooms. So this means that I use PowerPoint for my lectures. So there's a question from Damien here. How do you perceive international relations, and how could they change relations between IOs and member states? That's a fantastic question. So really looking at, perceive inter-organisational relations, and how could they change relations between IOs and member states? So it's a fantastic question in the sense that we now know international organisations compete with each other for member states' attention and resources. And if a state can go the other way as well, right? States can use international organisations to advance their interests, and if they don't perceive that they're getting what they want in a specific organisation, they can forum shift to another one. And certainly there's some fantastic research being done by colleagues on the European Union and the Eurozone crisis to look at how powerful states like Germany tried to shift towards using the International Monetary Fund when they felt that they weren't getting what they wanted out of the European Union, and you ended up with multiple organisations operating to address the Eurozone crisis. So this can change the relations between IOs and member states, because you're ultimately leaning on the organisation to do things that previously it might not have been expected to do, or undercutting or undermining other organisations that do have those mandates. So we typically think of the World Health Organization, for example, and the World Bank, where the World Bank is one of the largest funders for global health, which is not what we would automatically assume when looking at, when thinking about global health and the organisations that operate in that space. So when I teach, I tend to teach in 2-hour lecture blocks. This is kind of a norm at my institution. And so what I've been doing during the pandemic, when I'm teaching at home, is to try and find a way to break up that intensity of Zoom, which can be very, very draining. So what I do is I play music off YouTube to ensure that there is a break in the middle of the class. So I tell my students, okay, we've done the first hour of today's topic. So I'm trying to think tomorrow's topic is going to be the World Health Organization. We take a break in the middle, and I put in some songs from YouTube and play some clips. And I think that's been really, really helpful for students to sort of break up the intensity of the Zoom lectures. And what I've done is I've actually asked students to put in their song requests. And the basis for doing that is to actually hook in a song to the topic. So who runs the world? I can see here here's my IR playlist. General International Organization songs. It's the End of the World as We Know It and I Feel Fine by REM. We've got Everybody Wants to Run the World by Tears for Fears, covering realism, covering liberalism, covering constructivism, rationalism. I haven't actually finished my playlist, but I am getting there. So for health, for example, this week I'm looking at the Lady Gaga Home Alone. What is it? All Together Home Alone series, where the concert that she did in lockdown with a whole bunch of singers playing songs from in order to sort of raise money for all of the frontline workers all over the world. So that's just been kind of something fun, which also is helping students to think about the role that international cooperation plays and international organisations. And there's some fantastic songs out there, and it's been a kind of means to help students stay connected, because I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do here, is just get through this and try the best we can to get students to think about how the world works. So some of the questions, I've got another question from Gareth here. There is good evidence that engaging the affective domain is key to good online teaching. That's absolutely fantastic comment there, Gareth. I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the issues is to, here's another question. With classes either underway or about to start, do you have any advice on how to make students feel part of the class, even if they are learning remotely? That's fantastic. Absolutely. Oh, impressive music list. Thanks, May. Feel free to add to it, right? So this is the first time I've done it, and I'm absolutely enjoying it. But one of the ways to engage with students to make them feel part of the class is the synchronous. If you can do synchronous, that's fantastic. If you can't, or if there are equity reasons for you to want to teach asynchronous, absolutely do that. You know, we're in a pandemic. It's not something that happens every day. If you're normally teaching by distance, you might have your own strategies. But I find if you can teach synchronously, it was really important for me to do that with my undergraduates who are quite often living by themselves or in cramped conditions, that I make sure they use the chat function. So always asking, you know, what do you feel about this? What do you think about this? Always say hi at the start of a class. And I ask them, say hi in the chat. I want to know you're there, and I use their names. And I think that really matters. I think that absolutely matters. It matters for me, and it matters for them. It's nice to actually connect, even though, you know, we're all at home. So that's really important. And I'm glad you're going to steal the playlist idea, because I stole it from somebody else. So this is how we get great ideas, right? Absolutely. So I'm still working on mine, still trying to find some great ones on finance. I understand there's a song out there on the International Monetary Fund. I was halfway through investigating that one when I got called away to my lectures. Yeah, I'll keep posting those and keep putting them on Twitter as well, which is where, you know, I've been engaging with a whole bunch of colleagues who are really into music as to, you know, what's good for this week and what's going to work. And that kind of is a way for me to keep on top of things as well. So this is, you know, some of the things to sort of get students engaged. A couple of other things I've been doing, and maybe you look, I'm sure you will do them as well. Using short clips from YouTube to break up, you know, the lecture structure style to keep it fresh. I mean, we all know that there's that kind of students really after 20 minutes get a little bit exhausted. It's sort of good to reset. And, you know, when I was face to face, I would ask my students to stand up and turn around just to get the juices flowing. I think by about week 8, they were kind of over that. But you know, showing a short clip such as a PBS, part of a PBS documentary. You know, I've used PBS documentaries on the UN in Sudan. You know, there's some fantastic clips like the documentary that came out last year on the 25th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. I showed that in relation to the International Criminal Court and the difficulties of trying to prosecute criminal crimes through the court using those types of films. And of course, I get a lot of inspiration from my colleagues on Twitter as to, you know, what sort of pop culture hook-ins that you can attach to your classes. So what sort of movies and books you can sort of hint at or discuss as a sort of, if you're interested in this, you know, go forward and look at that in your own time. These are the types of, oh, excellent. We've got a recommendation. Thank you, Gareth. Arrogance, Ignorance and Greed by Show of Hands for Finance. Awesome. I'm totally going to look that up afterwards. So these are the types of things I use. You know, podcasts are really fantastic, either just to listen to a short bit or to put them up on Canvas or whatever your learning management site is. I really enjoyed the UN Dispatches podcast. They did a fantastic one on CEPI and vaccine nationalism versus multilateral efforts to get a vaccine. So I put that up in my classes. There are some that are more formal than others. So, for example, in the week on the environment, I'm going to put up the Sweaty Penguin podcast, which actually is run by students, is a sort of humorous take on global environmental governance that comes out of, I think it's Boston University. So these are the types of podcasts that you can put up for your students if they, you can either do it as part of your lecture or in addition to, like just some extra resources for students, because these are sort of, apparently we have much more time to listen to podcasts. So, I listen to them, if I get good recommendations. So always looking for good recommendations for international organisations. Look, I just want to talk a little bit more about assessment before we go to any more questions. I think how I've used my assessments have changed in relation to the sort of lockdown. I for my postgraduates, have always used open book exams, and that really speaks to the kind of cohort that I'm teaching. 33% of my students in my class are actually full-time workers who study part-time. And so I'd always adapt my assessment knowing that a third of the class really wants to do just an intensive assessment. And so I used to do an online open book exam where I would open the exam at 9 a.m. on a Friday and shut it at 9 a.m. on the Monday. And that way students that were working could manage their time. Now that we're in a lockdown, it's the first time I've tried to apply it to my undergraduates rather than just a 3-hour in-class exam in the exam period. And one of the reasons why I did that was really to get around the proctoring privacy issues that a number of universities were having in terms of trying to identify when a student was in their room at their computer doing their exam. And so all I did was just adapt that to the undergraduates and say, okay, we're going to have an open book exam. It's going to be 2 hours. It'll open, it'll shut. So the exam will open for you. You've got 2 hours. It's open book, proper referencing. These are the questions. Upload it before the 2-hour mark. Obviously, different for those students who need extra time. And we're just going to do it that way. And I think there was some relief, I think, with my students knowing that, okay, this is how we're going to do it. It's just going to be done within the unit. We're not going to be getting multiple emails from different parts of the university as to how to operate an exam. So that's just really part of my concern about making it as easy for the students as possible. But I also recognise now that because we're running most of the assessments through Turnitin, that we're really hoping to capture any of the concerns around academic integrity. So I think that will work, but we're only in week 6 here for my undergraduate class, so we'll see how that works. So that's really it from me. I think. If you've got any more tips and tricks that you have about how to teach online during the lockdown, that would be really, really helpful. But this is just how I've been doing it, and I've found the students are one of the key concerns for my students, and I'm not sure if yours are in the same position, but the biggest thing for us was how to keep our students connected. And that really stemmed from the fact that luckily where I am in this part of the world, the students aren't facing such dire safety concerns, although, the pandemic is obviously a concern, but it's not as immediate here. And so for us, the issue was, well, if students are all at home, how do we just make sure that they're with us? So that's really part of the focus on getting the music happening, getting them to choose their own essay question. Again, not because they're overwhelmed. There's some parts of the world where there's a lot of students are really, really struggling. For us, it's about how to keep them engaged and occupied in a positive sense, not alienated. So I've, first time in years, asked them to set their own question on international organisations. And that's a twofold process. So that's, the initial assessment, what is your question and how, what is your essay plan? How are you thinking about how you're going to do it? And then the second one is actually answering the question. And so that for me has been really fantastic because, previous semesters, normally, if I just set them questions, I see 2, 3, 4 students out of 80 actually come to my office and ask me about the essay question. But now I've got them popping up in my Zoom online drop-in office hour, and we have wonderful chats. I've had some really, really great email exchanges with students as to, well, just, okay, you're interested in this pretty obscure international organisation, that's great. How are you going to design that question? How are you going to find the information about how they operate? Or really taking something like Black Lives Matter and say, well, what do international organisations say about race? Let's look at what the UN is doing in terms of discrimination, in terms of the conventions, in terms of the committee bodies, in terms of the monitoring of commitments to those conventions. So that's been really, really fantastic. And obviously everyone's in different positions right now. And perhaps I would also make sure that I have a safety question for those students that just don't have the energy to go beyond just, that extra mile to design their own question. So I've got a question here. One question you bring out in your book is, are IOs a help or a hindrance when it comes to global problems? Do you have any early thoughts on how this question will relate to the current pandemic? That's a really, really great question. So I think, are they a help or a hindrance in relation to the current pandemic? I think we're going to find that a lot of international organisations didn't respond soon enough. And that itself comes from a mixture of factors, specifically around the fact that most states themselves immediately turned inwards. And so that really raises issues around can we, and scholars will have to answer this themselves in the future, can we point to international organisations that were pushing to do things? And I think the European Union, it's slow. It cranks its wheels. It's got a number of member states. They've got to come to agreement. And this is the nature of international cooperation. Where does the hindrance come in? Well, perhaps identifying literally how different organisations can help during the pandemic. And so that's a big empirical question that I think we're going to be answering for a very, very long time. But it has raised not only questions about how slow member states were to try and engage in cooperative action, but also to try and overcome, in some instances, how sort of tarnished relations with member states had already become. So, can we point to the fact that the Universal Postal Union was doing as much as it could have, given the fact that the United States was already not a fan of the organisation and had already threatened to leave? So these are the types of questions that, like I said, we're going to just be answering for a really long time, covering everything from the Universal Postal Union to obviously the World Health Organization, to the regional organizations, to the IMF and the World Bank, where they're doing enough to stimulate demand and to help protect developing countries. So these are obviously big questions that, a whole generation of scholars will be studying. Are there any more questions? So a few online resources that have been mentioned. So if you could put that up there on the screen. So PBS does these fantastic documentaries on survivors after the Rwandan genocide. This is from May, doesn't the slow response demonstrate an absence of authentic collaboration across international organizations? Yeah, it really, really could. I think certainly in the case of the World Bank, it's really about, I mean, international organizations have to respond pretty quickly, I think. And it's been a fairly tumultuous period since the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And so maybe it speaks to the fact that we need faster ways of operating. So if we can get agreement, then how do we roll it out relatively fast, in a relatively fast way? So I'm not sure if it's inauthentic, but I do wonder if there's enough trust in being able to provide the room or the autonomy for organisations to just be able to immediately respond. And this comes down to sort of questioning. I think some states are better than others in terms of identifying that there is trust in those cooperative arrangements and letting the organisations do what they do best. So there's a question from Gareth. Have you any insight on how NGOs, individuals, can work IOs to respond to their needs? So in your module, you look at the UNCRPD, and your students always point out that many signatory countries are still poor at responding to the needs of people with disabilities. That's a fantastic question. Yeah, it's a really interesting relationship between NGOs and international organisations, right? They can quite often be the best collaborators in terms of providing support and I wouldn't call it capacity, but sort of echoing and strengthening the work of international organisations. So many signatory countries are still poor at responding to the needs of people with disabilities. Do you think that's because, yeah, so I would say with the UN, it really comes down to a lack of resources, but you might have a different position on that. Every time I look at a different part of the UN that's a program or not specifically, not the UN Security Council, it comes down to resources, and it comes down to a failure of member states to adequately fund what it is that they want done. So UNICEF is a great example of a part of the UN that's really been very successful in being able to raise its own financing, so it is able to undertake its activities, and that is pretty unusual, I think. But you might know more about the specific UNCRPD. So we've also got the Sweaty Penguin podcast being advertised by Cambridge University Press. That's one that does some fun stuff on global environmental governance. And I'm not sure if there's any questions I've missed. I think there's also a link here for the Science Magazine podcast, Fighting the COVID-19 Vaccine Fears of Tracking the Pandemic's Origin and New Tech. Okay, so that's a really, really long, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to give you some ideas and some links that you can use for your classes. But I don't think there's, oh, here's a question from Minran. If you were to write another textbooks on IOs in the future, do you plan to include any new content? That's a great question. Look, originally I had 2 extra chapters in there. It was going to be a 13 chapter book. One of the reviewers, so the textbook went through 6 referees in the initial pilot pitch, and then went through another 4 referees after the first couple of chapters had been written. And one of the chapters that I was intending to write was on the International Labour Organization, because it is such an old institution. But the reviewers felt that it was a little bit too focused on sort of political economy type questions and needed to be a bit more rebalanced. So I would put another chapter or 2 on security, because there's some really fantastic, organizations. It was always considered high politics, low politics, international organizations don't do security. That's just not the case anymore. There's just so many organizations, both broad, organizations that have multiple functions, as well as much more specific organizations that are emerging around security. So I would absolutely include another chapter on security if I was going to write a sort of second version of this. But I think that's about it from me. Thank you so much for tuning in. And of course, feel free to look at the link for the webinar if you want to use it again in future. But also, if you're interested in the book and you'd like an instructor copy sent out to you, you can also look online through Cambridge University Press to do that as well. But thanks for coming, and good luck with your classes, and feel free to ask any more questions and we can get back to you in the future. And that's it from me. Thanks very much. Bye.